The rain had a way of remembering everything she tried to forget. It tapped softly against the broken windowpane, as if it knew the rhythm of her thoughts, as if it had been listening to her silence for years. She sat on the edge of a narrow bed in a small rented room that never quite felt like home. The walls were thin, the kind that carried the sounds of other people's lives. Laughter from downstairs, footsteps in the hallway, the distant hum of a television that belonged to someone who still had reasons to watch it. But inside her room, there was only the sound of breathing she sometimes forgot to do properly. It had not always been like this. There was a time when mornings had meaning, when sunlight felt like promise instead of reminder, when she used to wake up and think the day might carry something good instead of asking what else it would take away. But life had a strange habit of folding itself in ways she never learned to predict. It began with small things, the kind that do not announce themselves as tragedy. A missed call that was never returned. A doctor's appointment that lasted too long in silence. A diagnosis spoken gently, as if softness could reduce its weight. And then the slow disappearance of plans that had once seemed certain, names she had chosen in her heart, futures she had rehearsed quietly, moments she believed were hers by right of hope. She remembered the exact moment the world stopped negotiating with her. It was not loud. There were no dramatic breaks, no visible collapse. It was just a shift, like the ground deciding it no longer needed to support her the same way it used to. One day she was someone who belonged to a shared future, and the next she was someone learning how to exist inside absence. People told her to be strong. They said it as if strength was a coat she could simply put on before stepping outside, as if it did not have seams that tore from repeated use, as if it did not weigh more than grief itself. She smiled when they said it. That was what she had learned to do, smile in the right places, nod at the right moments, hold her pain so carefully that it never spilled onto anyone else's comfort. But inside, she was always carrying something heavy. Not just sadness, but a collection of it, the kind that gathers over time, the kind that does not leave even when the moment passes. It sits in corners of memory, waiting for quiet evenings like this one to return. She looked at her hands now. They were still the same hands, but they felt different, as if they belonged to someone who had lived too many lives in too short a time. She remembered holding small things that were not allowed to stay. She remembered preparing spaces that were never filled. She remembered speaking to silence as if it could answer back if she tried hard enough. There were days when she wondered if the world had mistaken her for someone else, someone stronger, someone meant to endure things without breaking, someone whose pain could be measured but never fully acknowledged. And yet she was still here. Not healed, not whole, but present. That was what confused her most, how survival did not always feel like victory. Sometimes it felt like being left behind by everything you thought would stay. At night, she would lie awake and listen to the building settle. Each creak felt like a reminder that everything living eventually learns how to carry weight, even houses, even walls, even hearts. She stopped counting the days after a while. Time became less about numbers and more about weather. Some days were sharp and cold, where even breathing felt like effort. Others were dull and gray, where everything blended into itself and nothing felt distinct enough to name. But there were rare moments, so brief she almost doubted them, when something inside her shifted. Not happiness, not even peace, something quieter, a softness that did not ask for explanation. Those moments always arrived unexpectedly. A stranger holding a door, a child laughing too loudly in a grocery aisle, a song drifting from a passing car that reminded her of nothing in particular, which somehow made it easier to breathe. In those seconds, she would remember that life had not completely abandoned the idea of gentleness. But then the moment would pass, and she would be left holding its echo. Tonight, the echo felt louder. She stood up slowly, walking to the window. The glass was cold beneath her fingertips. Outside, the world continued its usual rhythm, cars moving, lights flickering, distant silhouettes of people going somewhere she was no longer part of. She wondered when exactly she became an observer of life instead of a participant. It was not a single moment. It never is. It is 1,000 small exits, unnoticed until you realize you are no longer inside the room you thought you were in. She pressed her forehead lightly against the glass. The rain blurred the outside world into soft shapes, as if even reality was trying to be kind by not showing everything clearly. And then, for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to remember without resisting. She remembered laughter that used to belong to her home. She remembered warmth that was not just physical but shared. She remembered believing that life was something that moved forward in straight lines instead of loops of loss and adaptation. The memory hurt, but not in the way it used to. Before, it had been sharp, like touching something broken. Now it was dull, distant, like a scar that had finally learned how to stop bleeding but still knew where the wound had been. She wondered if that was what healing looked like. Not forgetting, not erasing, but learning how to hold pain without letting it define the shape of every breath. A sudden sound from downstairs pulled her back. Someone laughing, a door closing, life continuing in its ordinary, careless way. She stepped away from the window and sat again on the bed. There was still a long road ahead of her, though she could not see its shape yet. No map, no clear direction, only the faint suggestion that movement was still possible. She did not know what would come next. She did not know if tomorrow would be gentler or heavier or simply the same. But for the first time in a long while, she did not feel entirely convinced that everything had already ended. Outside, the rain continued. Inside, something small, almost imperceptible, stayed awake. The morning did not arrive as a comfort. It arrived like it always did now, without asking permission, without concern for whether she was ready to meet it. Light slipped through the thin curtains in uncertain stripes, touching the floor first, then the edge of the bed, then her hands as if testing whether she was still there. She had slept in fragments, the kind of sleep that never truly carries rest, but only pauses thought long enough to make it return heavier. For a moment, she stayed still, listening to the building wake up around her. Pipes shifting, a distant door opening, someone coughing in another room, the ordinary noises of lives continuing in directions she could no longer clearly trace. She sat up slowly, as if the movement required negotiation with her own body. There was a time when mornings meant beginning again. Now they only meant continuing what had never properly ended. She stood and walked to the small basin in the corner. The water that came out of the tap was always slightly too cold, as if even the pipes had no interest in comfort. She cupped it in her hands and let it touch her face. The reflection that stared back from the cracked mirror was familiar, yet distant enough to feel like someone she used to know rather than someone she still was. There were changes that grief made quietly, not always in appearance but in presence, in the way eyes stopped expecting, in the way shoulders learned to carry without asking for relief, in the way silence became a second language. She dressed without thought, clothes chosen more for function than feeling. Everything in her life had slowly become like that, reduced to what was necessary, stripped of what was once desired. When she stepped outside, the air was cool, carrying the leftover dampness of rain that had not fully decided to leave. The street was already awake, vendors setting up stalls, a bus passing too quickly, a child being called back by a tired voice that carried both love and urgency. She walked without a destination that mattered. Walking had become its own form of thinking, or perhaps the absence of thinking, a way to let the body move when the mind refused direction. She passed places that did not recognize her grief, shops that opened on schedule, walls that stayed unchanged, trees that continued growing without awareness of who was breaking underneath them. At a small corner, she stopped. There was a bench there she had never noticed before, or perhaps she had, but had never belonged to the version of herself that would sit on it. She sat. For a long time, she did nothing except watch. People moved past her like chapters she was no longer part of. Some hurried, some lingered, some laughed into phones as if life had not given them reason to lower their voices yet. She wondered what it meant to be invisible in a world that was still looking at itself so confidently. A thought arrived quietly, without force. No one was coming to rescue her, not because she was forgotten, but because rescue was not always how life worked. Sometimes it was not a single hand reaching down, but 1,000 small decisions made by the person who was falling. She did not know when she started falling, only that she had been in motion for a long time. Her mind drifted again, uninvited, toward the past, toward moments she usually avoided, but something about the stillness made memory less avoidable today. She remembered voices telling her what she should do, how she should feel, how long she should grieve before she returned to being normal. As if grief had a timetable, as if loss respected schedules. She remembered nodding even when she disagreed, because disagreement required energy she did not always have. There were days when she had learned to survive by becoming smaller, less visible, less demanding of space. And yet, even in that shrinking, something inside her had refused to disappear completely. A persistence she did not fully understand. A refusal that did not announce itself loudly, but remained quietly intact. A movement toward tomorrow, even when she had no belief in tomorrow. A shadow passed over her as someone walked in front of her. It pulled her back to the present. She looked up. The street had changed slightly while she had been sitting. Light had shifted. The air had warmed. Time had moved forward without asking if she was ready to follow. That realization used to frighten her, the idea that life continued regardless of her participation. Now it only felt like a fact. She stood again. Her feet carried her forward without instruction. By midday, the city felt louder, more insistent, as if everything that had been quiet in the morning had now decided to speak at once. She found herself near a small community center she had once passed many times but never entered. Today, the door was open. Not inviting, not closed, just open as if possibility itself was indifferent. Inside, there were people. Not many, not few, just enough to make the space feel alive. A notice board on one wall displayed simple words about support, gathering, shared spaces, conversations. Words she might have ignored on another day. But today, something in her hesitation felt different. Not fear exactly. More like recognition. She did not step fully inside at first. She stood at the threshold, watching, listening, trying to understand if she still had the right to enter spaces that required participation. A woman inside noticed her, not with judgment, but with a kind of awareness that did not demand explanation. After a moment, she stepped in. The air inside was warmer, not just physically, but in the way silence was held differently here. It did not feel empty, it felt shared. She took a seat near the edge of the room. No one asked her why she was there. No one required her to define herself in that moment, and that absence of demand felt unfamiliar enough to make her breathe differently. A conversation was happening somewhere in the room, not loud, not performative, just human voices trying to make sense of things that rarely made sense. She listened without intending to. At first, she thought she would leave quickly, that this would be another passing moment, like so many others. But time behaved differently here. It did not rush her. It did not push her forward. It simply allowed her to remain. And in remaining, something subtle began to shift, not outside, but within the part of her that had long stopped expecting gentleness from the world. She did not speak. Not yet. But for the first time in a long while, she did not feel entirely separate from the idea that speaking might one day be possible again. She stayed longer than she intended. That was the first thing she noticed. How time, which usually felt like something she had to survive, had begun to feel slightly less hostile inside that room. It still moved forward, still insisted on its own pace, but it no longer dragged her along with the same force. The voices around her rose and fell like waves that did not demand her participation. She could listen without being pulled under. She could exist without explaining herself. That alone felt unusual. A part of her kept expecting someone to turn toward her and ask why she was there, what story she carried, what pain had brought her into this space. She was used to having to translate herself for others, used to compressing her experiences into sentences small enough to be accepted. But no one did. Instead, there was a kind of quiet shared presence, as if everyone in the room had agreed, without words, that survival did not always need an introduction. She did not realize when her shoulders loosened slightly. It was not relief, not yet, but it was something close to the absence of constant tightening. When she finally stood to leave, no one stopped her. No one asked her to stay or return. That, too, felt unfamiliar. The freedom to come and go without obligation was something she had not associated with spaces for a long time. Outside, the light had shifted again. The day was moving toward afternoon, though she could not remember exactly when morning had ended. The world had continued its progression without asking her to mark each stage of it. She walked slowly. Her steps were not guided by urgency anymore. There was no immediate destination pulling her forward. For a while, she simply allowed herself to move through streets that had no expectation of her arrival. But something had changed. It was small, almost imperceptible, like a thread that had been loosened rather than cut. The weight she carried had not disappeared, but it had adjusted its position slightly, no longer pressing against the same edges of her being. She passed familiar places. Shops, corners, intersections that had once felt neutral but now carried faint associations of previous versions of herself. The self that had walked faster. The self that had looked down less. The self that had still believed in continuity. At a small roadside stall, she paused. Not because she needed anything, but because stopping no longer felt like failure. The vendor looked up briefly, offering a simple nod. No questions, no assumptions. She nodded back, then stepped aside without buying anything. It was a small interaction, barely noticeable in the flow of the day, but it lingered in her awareness longer than expected. She was beginning to notice how many moments of life existed without demanding meaning. That thought stayed with her as she continued walking. By the time she reached her room again, the sky had begun to soften into the muted tones that came before evening. The building was quieter now. Less movement in the hallway, fewer sounds of other lives pressing against her walls. Inside her room, the air felt unchanged. Still narrow, still worn, still holding the traces of all the days before. But she did not feel the same entering it. She sat on the bed and did not immediately lie down. Instead, she remained upright, hands resting loosely in her lap, as if testing what it meant to be present without collapsing into exhaustion the moment she stopped moving. Her thoughts came and went. Not all of them were heavy. Some were simply observations, the shape of the day, the tone of voices she had heard, the feeling of sitting among people without being asked to justify her existence. And then, slowly, the memory of the place returned. The community center. She had not planned to go there again. She had not planned anything at all. But something about the experience had not resolved itself inside her yet. It had not been filed away in the usual place where she kept temporary encounters. It remained open. That unsettled her slightly. Because openness, for her, had often preceded loss. Things that stayed open had a way of becoming painful later. But this felt different. Not like anticipation of loss, but like something waiting without pressure. She lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. The ceiling had stains she had memorized long ago. Shapes that resembled nothing and therefore allowed her mind to project whatever it needed. Today, she saw them without attaching meaning. Her phone vibrated once. She did not move immediately. Notifications had become things she approached carefully, as if they might carry emotional weight she was not prepared to lift. When she finally checked it, it was nothing important, a reminder, something unrelated to her internal world. She set it aside again. Silence returned. But it was not the same silence she had known before. This one felt less like isolation and more like space. She turned her head slightly toward the window. Outside, the sky had deepened in color. Not yet night, but no longer day in the same way. That transitional light always made her feel as if the world itself was uncertain for a moment. She thought about the people in the center earlier. Strangers, yet not entirely strangers in the emotional sense. There had been something shared in the room that did not depend on knowing names or histories. Something that existed simply because everyone there understood, in their own way, what it meant to continue. She wondered if she would return. The question did not feel urgent. It did not demand an answer immediately. It simply existed alongside her thoughts. And that too was new. Before, everything had been urgency or avoidance. Now there were things that could simply exist without pressing her toward action. She closed her eyes for a while. Sleep did not come quickly, but rest did. There is a difference she was only beginning to understand. The next days did not transform her life in dramatic ways. Nothing sudden happened. No single moment erased the weight she carried. No external event rearranged her reality into something unrecognizable. Instead, something quieter began to form. She returned to the center again. Not because she had decided to rebuild herself, not because she believed she was healing in any defined sense, but because returning felt less difficult than not returning. And that, in itself, was enough. Each visit remained different. Sometimes she only listened. Sometimes she sat at the edge of conversations without joining them. Sometimes she left early. Sometimes she stayed longer. No pattern was required of her. Slowly, she began to notice the presence of others not just as background, but as parallel lives moving through similar weight. Not identical pain, but familiar shapes of it. And in that recognition, something inside her stopped insisting that she was entirely separate from the rest of the world. She was still carrying grief. That did not change. But grief began to lose its total ownership over her. There were moments, brief, fragile, when she laughed softly at something small someone said. She did not chase those moments. She did not analyze them. She simply let them pass through her like air that did not demand explanation. One afternoon, as she sat near the same bench outside the center, she realized she had stopped bracing herself constantly. Her body still remembered the habit, but her mind was no longer obeying it at every second. That realization made her sit still for a long time afterward. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was real in a way she had not expected. She was not who she had been before loss. She could not return to that version of herself. But she was also not only what loss had made her. Something else was forming in the space between those two truths. And for the first time, she did not feel the need to rush that formation into completion. She began to notice mornings differently. Not because they changed, but because she did. The light still arrived through the same thin curtains, still fell across the same worn surfaces of her room, still touched the same quiet corners where dust gathered without apology. But something in her response to it had softened in a way she did not immediately know how to name. There was a time when waking up felt like being pulled back into something unfinished and heavy. Now it felt more like re-entering a space she had learned to move through, even if she did not fully understand it yet. She did not wake with hope. That would have been too large a word for something still so fragile. Instead, she woke with less resistance. And that was enough to change the shape of her days. She still carried the past with her. It did not disappear, nor did it become distant in the way people often described healing. It remained close, like a shadow that did not need to be feared anymore because it no longer moved unpredictably. It simply existed. She learned, slowly, that not everything inside her had to be solved. Some things only needed to be carried differently. Her visits to the community center became less uncertain over time. The threshold that once made her pause for too long began to feel less like a boundary and more like a passage she understood how to cross. No one treated her arrival as remarkable. That, strangely, was what made it easier. There was no expectation that she would become someone new, no pressure to explain what she had been before, no subtle demand that she measure her progress against anyone else's idea of improvement. She could simply be present. And presence, she discovered, was something she had been slowly losing without realizing it. There were days when she still sat quietly, listening more than speaking. But even in silence, she no longer felt absent from the room. She was part of it in a way that did not require performance. Other stories moved around her. Not identical to hers, but threaded with familiar emotions: loss, endurance, waiting, rebuilding, silence held too long. She began to understand something she had not allowed herself to consider before. Suffering was not a private language she alone had been forced to learn. It existed in many voices. That realization did not erase her pain, but it stopped isolating it completely. One afternoon, she arrived earlier than usual. The room was still mostly empty, chairs arranged loosely, sunlight falling in soft patches across the floor. The quiet before gathering had a different quality than the quiet after departure. It felt like something preparing itself rather than something ending. She sat near a window. Outside, people moved through their routines, a world that did not pause for internal transformation, a world that continued without noticing the subtle shifts happening inside her. For the first time, that did not feel like abandonment. It felt like continuity. A woman entered the room and greeted her with a simple nod. Nothing elaborate, nothing probing, just recognition. She returned the nod without hesitation. It was becoming easier to exist without explanation. As others arrived, the room slowly filled with movement and sound. Not chaotic, not overwhelming, but layered. Different lives occupying the same temporary space. She listened as conversations began. At first, she remained in her familiar role of observer. It was a position she had known for a long time, one that had once felt safe because it required nothing from her. But today, something shifted slightly. A sentence from someone across the room reached her differently than before. Not because it was extraordinary, but because it echoed something she had never spoken aloud. A silence she had carried for years recognized itself in another voice. She found herself breathing more deeply, without realizing it. Time passed in its usual quiet way inside the room. Not marked, not measured, but experienced in fragments. When the conversation shifted, she felt something unexpected, the beginning of willingness. It was small, almost invisible, not a decision, not a declaration. Just a moment where she did not pull back immediately. She spoke. The first words were not significant in content. They did not need to be. What mattered was not what she said, but that she said anything at all. Her voice felt unfamiliar to her ears, as if it belonged to someone she was slowly becoming reacquainted with rather than someone she currently was. No one reacted as if it were extraordinary. They simply listened. And then the conversation continued. That continuation mattered more than attention, because it meant she had not disrupted anything by existing within it. She left later than usual that day. Outside, the air was warm in a way that suggested the season was shifting, though she had not been paying attention closely enough to notice when it began. She walked slowly again, but not with the same heaviness she had once known. There was still weight within her, but it was distributed differently now, not pressing all at once but spread across moments, making it less sharp. She stopped at the same bench she had once sat on in silence. It no longer felt like a place of observation alone. It felt like a place of transition. She sat and looked at the street in front of her. People still moved with their own urgencies, their own directions. Life still did not pause to ask her permission to continue. But something inside her had changed in how she saw it. She was no longer outside of it in the same way. The thought did not bring joy, not exactly. It brought something quieter. Acceptance, perhaps, but not the kind that arrives as resolution. The kind that arrives as recognition that life is not waiting to begin again. It is already happening, and she is still within it. That evening, she did not rush to return to her room. When she finally did, the space felt less like confinement and more like pause. She noticed small things she had stopped noticing before. The way air moved through the slightly open window, the way light shifted as the day weakened, The way silence could feel different depending on what had come before it. She sat on the bed and thought of the people she had seen during the day. Not as distant figures, but as presences that had briefly intersected with hers. She wondered, for the first time without fear, whether she might return not just to listen, but to share more. Not because she had fully healed, but because she had begun to understand that healing was not a requirement for participation. That understanding did not erase her past, but it loosened its grip on her future. Outside, the evening deepened. Inside, she remained seated, no longer waiting for something to change before she could continue. Something had already begun changing, and she was no longer stepping away from it each time it appeared. The days began to feel less like separate events and more like layers of the same unfolding life. She could not say exactly when that shift happened. There was no clear boundary she could point to and say, "This is where everything changed." It was quieter than that. So quiet that if she had not been paying attention at all, she might have missed it entirely. But she was learning to notice now. Not everything, not all at once, but enough. She noticed, for example, that she no longer hesitated as long before stepping outside her room in the mornings. She noticed that the air outside did not feel like an obstacle anymore, just a condition. She noticed that sounds in the street, once overwhelming, once meaningless, had begun to arrange themselves into patterns she could recognize without effort. Life was not becoming easier. It was becoming familiar again. That difference mattered more than she expected. Familiarity did not erase pain, but it made it less disorienting. It stopped each moment from feeling like a new injury and instead made it feel like part of something already known. She still went to the center. Sometimes she arrived early, sometimes late. Sometimes she sat in the same place, sometimes she chose another. There was no rule she followed except the one that quietly formed inside her. She would go when she could and leave when she needed to. That freedom, simple as it was, still felt new. She was not used to being allowed to move at her own pace. One afternoon, the room felt different when she entered. Not because it had changed physically, but because the energy inside, it was already in motion. Conversations were happening before she had even fully taken her seat, a sense of gathering that felt slightly more animated than usual. She hesitated at the entrance for only a moment before stepping in. She chose a seat near the middle this time. It was not a conscious decision to be more visible. It was simply that her body no longer insisted on the edges the way it used to. As she sat, she noticed a subtle shift in herself, a quiet awareness that she was no longer scanning the room for escape routes. That instinct, once constant, had begun to loosen. She did not trust that completely yet, but she acknowledged it. The conversation that day was not structured in any formal way. It moved naturally, as it often did, between experiences, reflections, and pauses that allowed silence to sit comfortably between voices. At first, she listened as usual, but something in the flow felt different today. There was a sentence spoken by someone across the room that stayed with her longer than expected. Not because it was dramatic, but because it named something she had not yet been able to articulate even to herself. It was about carrying things that do not disappear, but slowly stop defining every step. She felt something tighten briefly inside her chest. Not pain exactly. Recognition. She looked down at her hands. They were steady. That realization surprised her more than she expected it to. There was a time when even sitting in a room like this would have required effort to keep herself from shaking inwardly. Now she could sit without that constant internal struggle. The effort was still there, but it was no longer consuming everything. She did not realize she had been holding her breath until she exhaled. It was small, but it was real. Later in the conversation, there was a pause, a natural lull where no one immediately filled the silence. It was in that moment, unexpectedly, that she spoke again. Not because she had planned to, but because the thought inside her had reached a point where it no longer felt possible to keep it contained. Her voice was quieter than others, but it carried. She spoke about days that felt like repetition, about how time could move without feeling like progress, about how even survival could begin to feel like a routine instead of a triumph. As she spoke, she expected interruption, or correction, or silence that felt like judgment. But none came. Instead, there was listening. That listening changed something in her more than the words themselves. Because it was the first time in a long while that her inner experience had been allowed to exist outside her, without being reshaped immediately into something more acceptable. When she finished speaking, she did not feel exposed. She felt lighter in a way she could not fully explain. Not free, but less enclosed. After the session ended, she did not leave immediately. She stayed seated while others gradually moved toward the exits or continued small conversations in clusters. The room slowly emptied in waves, but she remained still, watching the last fragments of activity settle. A woman near her gave a brief smile before leaving. It was not significant in any dramatic sense, but it stayed with her longer than expected, like a small acknowledgement that did not demand anything in return. Eventually, she stood and walked out. The evening air outside felt different again. Not new, not unfamiliar, but slightly more open, as if space itself had widened by a fraction. She walked without hurry. Her thoughts were quieter than they used to be. Not silent, just less crowded. There was room now between them. Room that had not been there before. She found herself thinking less about what had been lost and more about what was still present. Not in a forced or optimistic way, but in a simple observational way, like noticing that the sky changes even when you are not watching it directly. Her grief had not vanished, but it no longer occupied every corner of her awareness at all times. That realization did not come with celebration. It came with calm surprise. As she walked, she passed familiar streets again, but her relationship to them had shifted. The same walls, the same corners, the same movement of life around her, but she was no longer observing them from a place of separation. She was moving within them. That difference was subtle, but it mattered. By the time she reached her room, the sky had darkened into deep blue. She stood for a moment at the door before entering, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, as if acknowledging the transition between outside and inside. When she stepped in, the room did not feel different. But she did. She sat on the bed and rested her hands beside her, without immediately reaching for anything to distract herself. There was a kind of quiet that had begun to develop inside her that was no longer uncomfortable. It was not emptiness. It was space that did not demand to be filled instantly. She leaned back slightly. Her mind drifted, not toward pain, but toward reflection. She thought of how many versions of herself had existed in this same room. The one who could not imagine continuing. The one who only survived minute by minute. The one who believed nothing would ever shift again. And then the version sitting here now. Still carrying everything, but no longer entirely defined by it. She did not know what came next. That uncertainty no longer felt like threat. It felt like openness. Outside, the night deepened quietly. Inside, she remained awake for a while longer than usual, not because she could not rest, but because she was learning how to exist without rushing away from her own presence. And somewhere within that stillness, something small and steady continued forming, something that did not erase her past, but allowed her future to begin existing alongside it. The next morning arrived with a softness she did not expect. It was not that the world had changed overnight. The same light filtered through the same worn curtains, the same distant sounds of life moved through the building, the same ordinary rhythm continued outside her window. But something inside her had shifted enough that even unchanged things felt slightly different. She lay still for a moment longer than usual, not because she was resisting the day, but because she was no longer rushing to escape it either. That realization stayed with her as she finally sat up. There was a time when mornings felt like confrontation. Now they felt more like continuation. She moved through her routine without the same heaviness pressing every action into effort, washing her face, drinking water, preparing to step outside. Each act still existed, still required movement, but no longer carried the same emotional resistance behind it. It was not peace. Not yet. But it was less war. She left her room earlier than she had in the past few days. The air outside was cooler, carrying a faint clarity that made the street feel more open than usual. She walked without checking her pace too often. Her steps were becoming less measured by survival and more by presence. That thought surprised her. Presence had once felt like something she lost and could not retrieve. Now it was something she was slowly returning to without fully realizing the mechanics of how. The center was already familiar now. Familiar in a way that did not demand explanation from her body when she arrived. Her hand no longer paused before the door the way it once did. Her feet did not hesitate as often at thresholds. She entered. Inside, the room was already alive with movement and conversation. Not overwhelming, not chaotic, but gently layered. People arriving, settling, acknowledging one another in small ways that did not require performance. She took her usual place, though the word usual itself was beginning to lose its strictness. There was a time when she would have defined herself by where she sat. Edge, corner, distance. Now the edges felt less like protection and more like habit she was slowly outgrowing. She sat and listened. At first, everything was as it had been before. Voices moving, thoughts exchanged, pauses respected. But today she noticed something she had not paid attention to before, the ease with which silence was allowed to exist without being feared. Silence was no longer an absence here. It was part of the rhythm. A woman spoke about exhaustion that did not leave even after rest. Another spoke about learning to function while still carrying what could not be resolved. These were not stories framed for sympathy. They were simply shared experiences, offered without expectation. And in that offering, something inside her softened again. Not dramatically, but enough that she noticed. At one point, she realized her hands were no longer clenched. She had not noticed when they loosened. That absence of tension felt almost strange. The conversation shifted naturally, as it often did, moving between reflections and pauses. And again, without planning it, she found herself speaking. This time, it was not just reaction. It was participation. Her words were slower than others. Not hesitant, but careful in a way that came from long practice of holding things internally before releasing them outward. She spoke about the way time can feel unchanged, even when everything inside it has shifted. About how grief does not always announce itself loudly, but sometimes sits quietly in everything familiar until you stop noticing where it begins and where it ends. As she spoke, she noticed something different in herself. She was not waiting for permission anymore. Not from the room, not from others, not even from herself in the way she used to. She simply spoke, and the room held her words without interruption. When she finished, there was a brief silence. Not uncomfortable, just attentive. Then the conversation continued, weaving her words into the larger flow without isolating them as something separate or fragile. That mattered more than she expected it to, because it meant she had not broken anything by speaking. She had simply added to something already existing. After the session, she stayed longer again. Not out of uncertainty, but out of a growing sense that leaving immediately was no longer necessary. She watched people leave in small groups, some continuing conversations, others departing quietly. The room slowly emptied in layers, as if the energy itself was settling back into stillness. She remained seated. There was no urgency to stand. When she finally did, it was unforced. Outside, the daylight had grown stronger. The sun was higher, the air clearer. The street carried its usual movement, but she no longer experienced it as something separate from herself. She walked slowly at first, then more steadily. Her thoughts were not heavy today. They were spaced. That was the best word she could find for it internally. Spaced, not crowded, not overwhelming, just existing with room between them. She passed familiar places again. But familiarity no longer meant emotional weight by default. It meant recognition without collapse. She stopped briefly near a small shop window, not because she needed anything, but because stopping did not feel like interruption anymore. She looked at her reflection. It was still her, but not only her past, not only her loss. Something else was beginning to sit alongside those things without being erased by them. She did not smile, but her expression was not closed either. It was neutral in a way that felt strangely stable. She continued walking. By the time she reached her room, the day had already shifted into its later rhythm. Shadows stretching, light softening, sounds changing pitch as the world moved toward evening again. She entered and sat without delay this time. The room still held its same limitations, same walls, same quiet, same memory of all the days she had spent within it. But it no longer defined her the same way. She leaned back and closed her eyes for a moment. Her body felt tired, but not burdened. There was a difference forming between exhaustion and collapse. She was beginning to understand it slowly. She thought of the center again. Not as escape, not as solution, but as one of the places where she had begun to exist differently without needing to explain why. That thought stayed with her longer than most thoughts usually did, because it did not demand change. It simply acknowledged that change had already begun. Outside, evening settled gently. Inside, she remained still for a while longer, not escaping into sleep immediately, not forcing reflection either. Just existing in a space where her own presence no longer felt like something she had to survive moment by moment. And somewhere in that quiet, she understood something without needing to name it fully. Her life was still hers, even after everything it had taken. And that understanding, fragile as it was, did not leave her when she opened her eyes again. The days no longer felt like they were slipping past her unnoticed. She still did not measure them in any strict way, but she could feel their texture now. The way some mornings carried more clarity than others, the way some afternoons felt heavier without reason, the way evenings sometimes arrived gently and sometimes abruptly, as if the world could not decide how to end itself. She was beginning to notice patterns again. Not in life's outcomes, but in its rhythms. That alone felt like a return of something she had not realized she had lost, the ability to anticipate small things without fear. She woke earlier on her own now, without the weight of resistance that used to pull her back into stillness. The act of getting up no longer felt like an argument she had to win against herself. It simply happened. There were still moments, of course, when the past would rise unexpectedly. A sound, a memory, a silence that resembled another silence from another time. But those moments no longer swallowed the entire day. They passed through her, instead of stopping her completely. She had not expected that kind of change. Not the slow easing of intensity, not the way pain could remain present but less dominant, like background noise that no longer demanded attention every second. She continued going to the center. By now, it was no longer something she debated internally. It had become part of her weekly rhythm in a quiet, unspoken way, not obligation, not escape, something closer to continuity. The people there were still not hers, in any possessive sense, but they were no longer strangers either. They existed in a shared familiarity that did not require deep personal knowledge to feel real. One afternoon, when she arrived, the room felt unusually calm. Not empty, not full, just settled. She chose a seat slightly closer to the center than before. It was not a decision she analyzed. It simply happened. As more people arrived, the room filled with its usual blend of quiet anticipation and gentle conversation. There was something comforting in the repetition of it now. The same kind of chairs, the same patterns of greeting, the same way silence and speech balanced each other. It no longer felt like stepping into something unfamiliar. It felt like stepping into something ongoing. At one point, a discussion began that touched on endurance, not as something heroic, but as something ordinary. The kind of endurance that does not get recognized because it does not announce itself loudly. She listened closely. Something about the conversation felt closer to her than usual. Not because it described her exactly, but because it did not try to simplify what endurance actually felt like. There was honesty in it. And honesty, she was learning, was something her mind responded to differently than pity or instruction. When the conversation paused, she spoke again. This time, it came more naturally. Her voice did not hesitate at the beginning the way it once did. There was still care in her words, still thoughtfulness, but less internal resistance before expression. She spoke about how silence can become a habit rather than a choice. How over time, not speaking about pain can begin to feel like the only way to survive it, even when it no longer protects anything. As she spoke, she noticed something unusual. She was not monitoring herself as much. There was a time when every word she said would be followed by internal judgment. Too much, too little, too emotional, too exposed. But now there was more space between speaking and self-critique. Not complete freedom from it, but distance. When she finished, no one interrupted the flow of conversation. No one turned it into something centered only on her. Instead, her words blended into the shared space and became part of a larger reflection. That mattered more than she expected, because it meant she did not have to be reduced in order to be heard. Afterward, she stayed seated while others continued talking in small groups. She watched without feeling detached. That was another change she had started to notice. Observation no longer meant separation. She was present even when quiet. When she finally stood to leave, it was later than she usually stayed in earlier days. But there was no discomfort in that, no internal pressure pushing her out. She simply left when it felt right. Outside, the sky was brighter than expected. A clear stretch of light spreading across the upper horizon, soft but open. The air carried a faint warmth that made movement feel easier. She walked without urgency. Her thoughts drifted, but not in heavy loops. They were more like observations now. She noticed small details again, the sound of footsteps beside her, the way people moved past each other without collision, the way the world functioned in constant motion without requiring her interpretation of it. At one point, she realized something quietly significant. She was no longer bracing herself every time she entered a new moment. That constant internal tightening, once so familiar she did not even recognize it as tension, had begun to fade. Not disappear, but loosen. She paused briefly near a quiet street corner. There was no reason for the pause. She simply allowed it. She looked around without searching for meaning. And for the first time in a long while, she felt no urge to escape the present moment. Not because everything was perfect, but because it no longer felt threatening. She continued walking home. The journey felt shorter than before, though the distance had not changed. When she reached her room, she stood at the door for a brief moment, not in hesitation, but in awareness. The threshold between outside and inside no longer felt like a divide between life and isolation. It was just a transition. Inside, she sat down and let her body relax fully for the first time that day. Her thoughts drifted again, but softly. She thought about how much had changed, without anything dramatic happening. No sudden transformation, no single event that rewrote her life. Just repetition, presence, return. And in that quiet accumulation, something within her had begun to reorganize itself. She was still carrying everything she had carried before, but she was no longer disappearing under its weight. And that difference, though subtle, was becoming the foundation of something she had not yet fully named, but was slowly beginning to trust. The night had a different quality now than it used to. It was still quiet, still long, still filled with the same spaces where thoughts could easily grow heavier than they should. But she no longer entered it with the same sense of collapse she once carried. There was a time when night meant being left alone with everything she could not escape during the day. Now it felt more like a pause between continuations. Not an ending. Not a punishment. Just a softer kind of time. She sat by the window for a while after returning from the center. The glass reflected her faint outline against the dim room, and for once she did not look away immediately. She observed it the way one might observe a familiar object that has slowly changed its meaning over time. Her reflection was still marked by everything she had lived through. That did not disappear, but it no longer felt like the only thing visible. There was something steadier in her gaze now. Not certainty, but endurance that had stopped trembling constantly. She leaned her head slightly against the wall beside the window. Outside, the world had quieted. A few distant lights, occasional movement in shadows, the kind of stillness that belonged to places where people were still awake but no longer rushing. Her mind moved gently through the events of the day. The center, the conversation, her own voice speaking without hesitation forming first. The way silence had not felt like exposure afterward. These were not dramatic memories, but they stayed with her in a different way than before, not as emotional weight, but as evidence of something shifting. She was beginning to collect moments not of survival alone, but of participation. That thought made her still for a while. Participation. It was not a word she had associated with herself for a long time. She had known endurance, withdrawal, observation, silence. But participation suggested something more active, something shared, something that existed even when she was not trying to control it. Her thoughts drifted further back, not sharply, but gently. She remembered how carefully she used to move through spaces, how much effort it took just to appear unaffected, how exhausting it was to constantly manage what others might see, while internally carrying everything at once. That version of her still existed in memory, but it no longer defined the present moment completely. She closed her eyes for a while. Not to escape, just to rest within herself, without resistance. When she opened them again, the room felt unchanged, but her perception of it had softened. The walls were still the same, the air still slightly narrow, the sounds still distant and faint. But it no longer felt like a container holding her in. It felt like a place she was temporarily within. That subtle difference mattered more than she could explain. The next day arrived without urgency. She woke and for a moment remained still, not from reluctance, but from awareness that she no longer needed to rush away from waking itself. Her body felt lighter than it used to, though not physically so in any dramatic sense. It was more like internal pressure had reduced, allowing her to breathe without noticing it every time. She went through her routine slowly. There was no need to force momentum anymore. When she left for the center, she noticed something she had not before. She was no longer rehearsing what she might say or whether she would say anything at all. Speech had become optional in a way it never used to be, but also more available when she chose it. The center was familiar now, in a way that felt quietly grounding. She entered and took a seat without scanning the room for safety or escape routes. That instinct still existed somewhere inside her, but it was no longer leading her decisions. As the session began, she listened. And as she listened, she realized something unexpected. She was not waiting for the moment to end. There was a time when even good moments were accompanied by anticipation of their disappearance. But now, she was able to remain inside them while they lasted. That shift was subtle, but it changed everything about how time felt. A discussion began about rebuilding, not in a grand sense, but in the small ways people rebuild themselves without noticing it. She felt something inside her respond quietly. Not resistance. Recognition. When it became her turn to speak, she did not feel the usual pause before beginning. Her words came with a steadiness that surprised even her. She spoke about how rebuilding is often misunderstood as becoming someone new, when in reality it can sometimes mean simply returning to parts of yourself that were never fully lost, only buried under survival. As she spoke, she noticed something else. She was no longer trying to sound correct. She was simply speaking truth as she experienced it. That difference made her voice feel different too, not louder, but more grounded. When she finished, the room did not shift around her. It continued as it always did, gently flowing into the next moment. But inside her, something had settled. Not resolved, but acknowledged. After the session, she remained seated for a while longer than usual. People moved around her, conversations faded, chairs shifted slightly as the room began to empty. She watched it all without feeling like she needed to rush into solitude or escape from presence. Eventually, she stood. Outside, the air felt clearer again. The sky had that in-between quality, neither fully day nor fully evening, a space of transition. She walked slowly, not because she was tired, but because she no longer needed speed to justify movement. Her thoughts were calm, not empty, just no longer crowded. At one point, she realized something simple but profound. She was no longer living as if her past was happening at the same intensity as her present. It was still there, but it was no longer overlapping everything. When she reached her room, she did not immediately sit or lie down. She stood for a moment in the center of it. The space felt unchanged, but her relationship to it had shifted gradually over time. It was no longer the place where her world collapsed inward. It was simply where she returned. She sat down finally, exhaling softly. There was no dramatic realization, no sudden clarity. Just continuity. And in that continuity, something within her continued to quietly, steadily form, not as a replacement for what she had lost, but as a way of existing alongside it without being consumed by it. The morning arrived without hesitation, as if it had never once doubted whether she would meet it again. She noticed that thought briefly, and then let it pass. Her mind was learning a different rhythm now, one that did not cling to every observation, one that did not try to turn every moment into meaning or warning. Some thoughts could simply arrive and leave without being examined too deeply. That itself felt like a kind of relief she had not known how to ask for. She got ready more naturally these days. There was less internal negotiation involved in simple actions. Even the act of stepping outside no longer felt like crossing a boundary she might not return from emotionally. The world remained the same, but her relationship with it had shifted just enough that it no longer felt like it was constantly opposing her. At the center, she noticed small changes in herself that were not immediately obvious, but became clearer over time. She no longer chose seats based on protection. She no longer scanned every expression in the room for hidden judgment. She no longer waited for permission to exist within conversations. These were not decisions she made consciously. They were the result of repetition, of exposure, of slowly learning that not every space required defense. That morning, the room felt slightly more animated than usual. Not louder, just more alive in its movement. She took her seat and listened as conversations began forming in their natural layers. There was a sense of familiarity now, not with individuals necessarily, but with the shared atmosphere. The understanding that everyone there carried something unspoken, and yet still chose to sit in the same space anyway. That quiet agreement had begun to feel meaningful to her. Not in a dramatic way, but in a grounding one. As the discussion unfolded, she found herself paying attention more deeply than usual. Not because anything demanded it, but because she was no longer emotionally overwhelmed by simply being present. Her capacity for attention had returned in small increments. And with it, her ability to reflect without drowning in reflection. A topic emerged about change, not sudden change, but gradual transformation that becomes visible only when you look back. She listened closely. When it came time for others to speak, she remained silent for a while longer than usual. Not because she was avoiding it, but because she was feeling something internally that was difficult to immediately translate into words. It was not pain, not joy, something between recognition and acceptance. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. She said that sometimes change does not feel like change at all while it is happening. That it feels like repetition, like simply continuing to exist through days that look similar, until one day you realize you are no longer reacting the same way you used to. As she spoke, she realized she was describing herself without intending to. But it no longer felt exposing. It felt honest. And honesty, she was learning, did not always have to be painful. When she finished, no one paused the flow of conversation around her. It continued naturally, as if her words were part of something already understood. That continuity made her feel strangely included, in a way she had not expected. Not singled out, not isolated, but integrated. Afterward, she stayed longer than she planned again. Not because she was uncertain, but because leaving was no longer something she needed to rush toward. She observed the room as it slowly transitioned toward its quieter phase. Chairs shifting, soft goodbyes, conversations tapering into smaller fragments. There was comfort in that rhythm now. Not excitement, but steadiness. Eventually, she stood and left. Outside, the air felt slightly warmer than the previous days. The kind of warmth that does not announce itself loudly, but settles gently into the skin. She walked without thinking too much about direction. Her thoughts were less heavy now. Not absent, but arranged differently. There was space between them. That space made everything feel more manageable. She passed familiar streets again, but the emotional charge they once carried had softened. They were no longer reminders of loss or absence. They were simply parts of a route she was learning to move through without internal resistance. At one point, she paused near a quiet intersection. Not because she was overwhelmed, but because she could. That ability, to stop without collapse, felt quietly significant. She looked around. People passed, life continued, nothing paused for her awareness. And for the first time, that did not feel like abandonment or indifference. It felt like the natural condition of the world. She was no longer outside of it. She was within it, moving at her own pace. When she finally reached her room, she did not immediately sit. She stood in the doorway for a moment, observing the space without the emotional weight it once carried. It was still small, still worn, still unchanged, but it no longer defined her internal state upon entry. She stepped inside and sat down. Her body relaxed slowly, not out of exhaustion, but out of permission. She thought briefly about the center again, not as a place she depended on, but as a place where something inside her had begun to remember how to speak. That memory stayed with her longer than most thoughts now, because it no longer felt like something fragile. It felt like something that had begun to stabilize. And in that stabilization, she did not feel an ending approaching. She felt continuation. A life that was still unfolding, not in dramatic turns, but in steady, quiet return. The days no longer felt like they were slipping through her fingers. Instead, they felt like they were settling into place. Not neatly, not perfectly, but with a kind of structure she could now recognize without confusion. Some days were still heavy, some still quiet in a way that made her more reflective than usual, but none of them felt like complete collapse anymore. That was the change she kept noticing most. Not happiness, not sudden healing, but the absence of total overwhelm. She woke that morning with a different kind of stillness inside her. Not emptiness, but steadiness. The kind that does not demand immediate interpretation. The kind that simply allows the body and mind to exist without urgency. She sat by the window for a while before moving. The light outside had softened into something calm. Not bright enough to demand attention, not dim enough to feel heavy. Just present. She observed it without needing it to mean anything more than what it was. That too was new. When she left for the center, her steps felt natural, not forced, not hesitant, not overly intentional, just movement that belonged to her day without resistance. The world around her had not changed its pace. People still rushed. Vehicles still passed. Conversations still flowed in fragments she did not need to fully enter, but she no longer felt like she was struggling to keep up with it. She was moving within it now. Not against it. Not outside of it. Inside it. At the center, she noticed something subtle when she entered. The room no longer felt like a space she was borrowing. It felt like a space she could enter without justification. That realization did not come with emotion. It came with recognition, a quiet acknowledgement that her presence there had become something stable, not temporary. She took her seat and listened as usual. But even listening felt different now. There was less internal noise competing with the voices around her, less self-monitoring, less anticipation of emotional overload. Her attention could rest on others without fracturing under its own weight. A conversation began about what it means to continue after loss, not in the sense of moving on, but in the sense of learning how to carry what remains without letting it erase everything else. She felt a quiet alignment with those words. Not agreement in a verbal sense, but recognition in a lived sense. When it was her turn to speak, she did not hesitate. Her voice had become more familiar to her now, less like something she had to carefully retrieve and more like something that naturally emerged when needed. She spoke about how continuation is often misunderstood as forgetting, but in reality, it can mean learning how to let life exist alongside memory without requiring one to cancel the other. As she spoke, she noticed something important. She was no longer separating herself from her own experience while describing it. She was inside it, but not drowning in it. When she finished, the conversation continued smoothly around her. That continuity felt important again, not because she needed validation, but because she no longer felt like her words disrupted anything by existing. After the session, she stayed for a while. The room slowly emptied, as it always did, but she did not feel the need to rush out of it anymore. She remained seated, watching the final movements of people leaving, the gradual quiet settling back into the space. There was comfort in that rhythm now. Not attachment, but familiarity. Eventually, she stood and walked outside. The afternoon light was clearer than expected. The sky carried a brightness that felt steady rather than intense. The air was neither heavy nor sharp. She walked without thinking about where she was going beyond the immediate steps. Her thoughts were quieter now. Not absent, but arranged in a way that no longer overwhelmed her. She noticed things she might have once passed without seeing. The way shadows shifted along walls, the sound of distant conversations blending into background rhythm, the small pauses between movements of strangers passing her. Everything felt less like noise and more like texture. At one point, she stopped briefly at a familiar corner. Not because she was lost, but because stopping no longer meant she was breaking down. She looked around and realized something simple. She was not waiting for her life to begin again. It was already ongoing, and she was inside it. When she finally returned to her room, she did not collapse into exhaustion as she once might have. She simply entered, sat, and allowed herself to be still. The room was unchanged, but she was not meeting it as the same version of herself anymore. There was less weight attached to being here, less sense of confinement, more sense of pause. She leaned back slightly and closed her eyes. Her mind moved gently through the day, not replaying it with anxiety, but observing it with quiet awareness. She thought of how her voice had sounded when she spoke. Steadier, less guarded. Not because pain had disappeared, but because it no longer controlled the shape of every expression. She thought of how the room had received her words without interruption. Not as something exceptional, but as something part of the shared space. That mattered more than she could have explained before. When she opened her eyes again, the evening had begun to settle. The light had softened. The room felt dimmer but not heavy. She sat quietly for a long time, without reaching for distraction. There was no urgency in her thoughts now, only continuity. And in that continuity, something within her felt like it had finally stopped breaking repeatedly. Not because everything was fixed, but because she was no longer fighting every moment just to remain inside her own life. She exhaled slowly and stayed there, present, not healed in a perfect sense, but no longer lost in the way she once was. The night before had not been heavy, and that in itself was something she noticed in the morning. There was a time when she would wake up already carrying the weight of the previous day, as if sleep only paused her suffering rather than softening it. But now, mornings were beginning to arrive without that immediate pressure. She lay still for a while, eyes open, listening to the quiet of her room. Not empty quiet, just ordinary quiet. And ordinary, she was learning, was something she had once taken for granted without realizing its value. When she finally stood, the movement felt natural. Her body no longer resisted the day in advance. Even small actions, washing her face, adjusting her clothes, opening the door, felt like parts of a rhythm she was becoming accustomed to again. Outside, the world continued its usual pace. But she no longer felt like it was rushing past her or leaving her behind. She walked toward the center without hesitation. That, too, had become part of her rhythm now. Not obligation, not escape, but continuity. When she entered, the familiar atmosphere greeted her without intensity. There was no emotional shock anymore in stepping into that space. It had become something stable in her life, something that existed alongside everything else rather than replacing it. She took her seat and settled in. Her presence there no longer felt like an exception. It felt like participation in something ongoing. The session began as it usually did, gentle conversations unfolding, pauses respected, voices layering naturally over silence. She listened, but she also noticed how she was listening now. Earlier, listening meant absorbing while protecting herself at the same time. Now it was less defensive, more open, less fractured. A conversation emerged about acceptance, not the forced kind, but the gradual kind that forms when life does not give alternatives and yet continues anyway. She felt something align quietly inside her. Not agreement in theory, but recognition in experience. When she spoke, her voice was steady, not strong in a dramatic sense, but grounded. She spoke about how acceptance is not a single decision, but a slow unlearning of resistance. How it arrives not when pain disappears, but when pain stops being the only lens through which everything is seen. As she spoke, she realized she was no longer carefully filtering herself for safety. She was simply expressing what felt true. When she finished, there was a brief pause in the room, not of judgment, but of reflection. Then the conversation continued naturally, weaving her words into the broader flow without isolating them. That integration mattered to her more than she expected, because it meant she was not separate from the space. She was part of it. After the session ended, she remained seated again. This had become a quiet habit now, not avoidance, not delay, but presence. The ability to stay without needing immediate transition. People gradually left, chairs shifted, voices faded into smaller clusters. The room slowly returned to silence. She watched it all without urgency. Eventually, she stood and stepped outside. The afternoon light was softer than she expected. It did not press against her the way harsh brightness sometimes did. It simply existed around her. She walked slowly, but not with hesitation. Her thoughts were quieter again, less fragmented, more spacious. She noticed small things along her path, the rhythm of footsteps, the movement of air, the way distant sounds blended rather than interrupted. These details no longer overwhelmed her. They accompanied her. At one point, she stopped near a familiar street corner, not because she needed to recover, but because she could simply pause. That ability, pausing without collapse, felt like something she was still learning to trust. She stood there for a moment, observing the world without needing to assign meaning to it. And in that observation, she realized something quietly important. She was no longer living as though she were waiting to become someone else. She was already becoming. And that becoming did not feel like a destination anymore. It felt like movement she was allowed to remain inside. When she finally reached her room, she did not rush into stillness or distraction. She entered slowly, acknowledging the space as she passed through it. Then she sat. The room was the same as always, small, familiar, unchanged in structure. But her experience of it had shifted over time. It no longer felt like a place she was trapped in during the in-between moments of life. It felt like a place she returned to. That distinction mattered more than she could have explained in words. She leaned back slightly, exhaling. Her thoughts drifted gently through the day. There was no urgency in them now. No pressure to resolve anything. Only awareness. She thought of how her voice had changed, not in tone, but in ease. How speaking no longer felt like stepping outside herself, but rather allowing a part of her to exist openly. She thought of how silence in the room no longer felt like judgment, but like shared understanding. And she thought, without needing to force the thought into meaning, that something within her had settled into a new kind of stability. Not perfection, not completion, but continuity without constant fracture. She closed her eyes for a while. And in that quiet, she remained, not escaping her life, not trying to fix it in her mind, but simply existing within it with a kind of steadiness she had not known before. The final stretch of days did not announce themselves as anything final. There was no clear moment when she could say everything had changed and nothing more would follow. Life did not offer endings in that way. It only continued, quietly reshaping itself while people slowly realized they were no longer where they once were. And she was no longer there either. Not in the way she had been. She woke that morning with a calm she no longer found surprising. It had become less of an event and more of a condition, something that existed in the background of her awareness without demanding attention. She sat up slowly, noticing how natural movement had become again. Not effortless, but no longer resisted at every step. The world outside her window looked the same as it always had. Streets carrying their usual rhythm, light shifting through its familiar patterns, life unfolding without pause or permission. But she was no longer standing outside of it. She was within it. That understanding had settled over time, not as a sudden realization, but as something accumulated through repetition, presence, and return. She got ready without hesitation. There was no internal debate about whether she would go to the center anymore. It was simply part of her day, like breathing or walking or waking. When she arrived, the atmosphere was familiar in a way that no longer carried uncertainty. Familiarity had become something she could trust again, not because everything was resolved, but because nothing there demanded she be anything other than present. She took her seat and looked around. There was a quiet comfort in recognizing not just the space, but her place within it. The session began as it always did. Voices, pauses, shared reflections forming a rhythm that no longer felt foreign to her. She listened. But now, listening was no longer an act of protection. It was an act of presence. A conversation unfolded about what remains after everything else has changed. Not what is lost, but what stays. She felt that questions settle inside her in a way it would not have before. When she spoke, her voice carried a calmness that had been built slowly over time, not given suddenly. She said that what remains is not always visible at first, that sometimes it is not hope in a loud or bright form, but a quiet willingness to keep moving even when nothing feels guaranteed. That survival itself, when no longer purely reactive, begins to turn into something closer to living. As she spoke, She did not feel exposed. She felt aligned, not with perfection, but with truth as she knew it. When she finished, the room did not pause around her in surprise. It simply continued, her words becoming part of the ongoing flow of shared understanding. That continuity had become something she valued deeply, because it meant she was not separate. She was included. After the session ended, she stayed for a while longer, as she often did now. There was no urgency to leave. No need to escape. She watched as the room slowly softened into quiet, people leaving in small waves, conversations dissolving gently into silence. And she remained, not because she was holding on to anything, but because she no longer felt pushed away by stillness. Eventually, she stood and stepped outside. The air felt balanced, not too sharp, not too heavy. The kind of afternoon that does not demand interpretation, only passage through. She walked slowly. Her thoughts were steady now, not crowded or fragmented. There was space between them. That space had become one of the most significant changes she had ever experienced. Though it had arrived so quietly, she almost did not notice it forming. She passed familiar streets without emotional collision. They were no longer reminders of who she had been or what she had lost. They were simply part of the world she moved through. At one point, she stopped briefly, not because she needed to recover from anything, but because she could. That ability alone felt like a form of quiet freedom. She stood there and observed life moving around her. And for the first time, she did not feel like an outsider watching it. She felt like someone within it, sharing its time without needing to control its meaning. When she returned to her room later, the light was soft and fading. She entered slowly and sat down without delay. The room was still the same, but she was not. That difference was not dramatic. It was steady. It was quiet. It was real. She exhaled and let herself remain still. There was no need to process everything anymore. No need to constantly analyze every shift or measure every feeling against the past. Life was not something she had returned to. It was something she had continued into. Not perfectly, not without pain, but without being defined entirely by that pain anymore. She thought briefly of everything that had unfolded, not as a story with a sharp ending, but as a long, gradual return to herself in fragments. And she understood something without needing to fully articulate it. Hope had not arrived as a rescue. It had arrived as persistence, as presence, as the quiet decision to remain inside a life that once felt unbearable until it slowly became livable again. Outside, night settled gently. Inside, she remained. Not as someone healed beyond memory, but as someone who had learned how to carry memory without disappearing inside it. And in that quiet continuation, her life did not end. It simply kept going, steadier, softer, and finally her own again.